tell me when it's fine.
We can go.
Sarah, in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on the day of Africa's Scientific Renaissance. I'm really excited to be your moderator. So I'll mostly be shutting up and moderating a discussion, but I'm Sarah Menker. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Grow Intelligence, which is a global agricultural data analytics company. I'm an Ethiopian. I'm also a trustee of Minds, who's the host of this webinar, really excited to have everybody here for a really important discussion, because there are many narratives that are out there that measure Africa's potential in terms of its human and its mineral wealth, but to look at just these assets diminishes the wealth of knowledge accrued among the continent's many unique civilizations. And the tragedy is that history has paid little attention to this aspect of Africa. It's hard to find any information at all. So we don't even know what we're missing and what problems so much of our culture has already addressed, meaning what solutions do we already have that the world doesn't even know about. And that's ultimately what innovation is about. That's how it comes about. And so the contributions of Africans to science are well documented, but that work doesn't connect to the continent's traditional knowledge or practices. Connecting that kind of full stream is really what we don't know what that can unlock for the continent. And so this discussion today is very much about starting that conversation. It's by no means a solution, and we have some wonderful guests that are joining us on the webinar that will be speaking to everybody about this. And so with that, I'll do some quick introductions on who our speakers are, and then open the floor to them. Just a couple of issues on protocol around the webinar to keep in mind. Please, there's a Q&A button that you should be able to see. Feel free to send in your questions as the webinar is going on. We'll be collecting the questions, and then we'll be calling on you during the Q&A section. So please send the questions as we go along as well, though, so we can start to allocate questions to who it's relevant to and start sorting through that. But feel free to send along questions as we're going along, and we encourage you to ask as many questions as possible. And what we don't get to, we'll also make sure that we are following up on. So with that, I'll do some quick introductions and then leave the floor to our speakers. First, we'll have Dr. Moyo, who is the founder of Minds, and will be giving us some opening remarks. Then that will be followed by Professor Kaya, who's the director of the DSI NRF Center in Indigenous Knowledge Systems at University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Then we also have Mr. Amin Idris Adum, who is the Auda NEPAD Director of Programs, Delivery and Coordination. We also have Professor Mukse Nkondo, who's a member of council in University of South Africa. And then we have Dr. Chabalala, who's the National Director of the Indigenous Knowledge-Based Technology Innovation Unit of the South African Department of Science and Innovation. And then we will also have closing remarks by Mrs. Grasa Michelle, who is the chairman of Minds. And so with that, I open the floor to Dr. Moyo to kick us off with some opening remarks. If you can.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much, Sarah. In terms of today's event, I don't want to take much time because my system just disappeared and came back again. I don't want to take too much time because, in fact, our program is very compressed. But all I want to highlight today is that we as Africans are having to walk a very tightrope between understanding the dynamics of competition and cooperation without getting negative about the interaction with the global community. In other words, we have to continue to be positive, but be much more aware of the dynamic of what goes on. So the fact that when you read today's concept note, most of us will realize that we're quite ignorant about the number of Africans, notable African scientists who have achieved globally notable achievements and research and discoveries and what have you. But we're just not aware of it. And we have to ask ourselves, why is it we were not aware of this? And what are the tools of competition which undermine a people's confidence in order to give the other side the upside, so to speak? And rather than looking at that as unjustified, immoral, and such other adjectives, we need to understand it as competition and understand that when you look globally, if you look at the Americans and Europeans, for instance, who are fundamentally the same people, the people running the US came from Europe, but you will notice that they are in intense competition with each other all the time. So competition is what in many ways creates success and advancement. And therefore, from that perspective, it's a healthy thing. But if you're not careful, if you don't own your own narrative, competition can be very disempowering in terms of the tools that can be used, such as creating the impression that your own people have achieved nothing, are incapable of achieving anything, and therefore you start almost worshipping other nations and their achievements. We need to just be aware of this dynamic. It is our responsibility, not somebody else's responsibility. And this is where the danger with us, I think, lies, where we are inclined to beg, to want the other side to be nice to us. People, generally speaking, are not nice to each other. They compete with each other. And they will only cooperate with you when they feel you've got a value add to the proposition that they want to put on the table. So I want to leave my comments on this note. Let's own the narrative of our own histories, our own achievements, so that we can give our children the confidence through seeing what their people, their parents, their grandparents have done and achieved. It will give them a sense of self-belief that they can do as well. It is our responsibility, however. Let's not ask somebody else to change their narrative, because their responsibility is to tell their own narrative. Our responsibility is to tell our own narrative and give our children a perspective that comes from us, which will give them a foundation that is firm in self-belief so that they can achieve even more. So let me leave it at that, because like I said, we don't have too much time. Thank you very much for attending, and good luck with the conversation. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Dr. Moyo. Next, I'll call on Professor Kaya, who will kick us off in the dialogue.
No, I was muting but I hope everybody can hear me. Yeah, good afternoon, colleagues and the other participants across the continent. And I acknowledge the presence of Mama Michelle. My contribution today, I'm supposed to give an overview of science within the context of indigenous knowledge systems. And given the limited time I have, I think I was given 5 minutes, I will try to combine the responsibilities of our center, which is now a center of excellence in indigenous knowledge systems, with the IKA's conceptualization of science. First of all, I would like to say that the Center in Indigenous Knowledge Systems is a partnership of 5 South African institutions: University of KwaZulu-Natal at the hub, UNISA, Northwest University, University of Venda, and University of Limpopo. And our mandate is to promote, to protect, and preserve Indigenous knowledge systems as a new area of inquiry in the knowledge domain. And our conceptualization of science is the pursuit of knowledge. And I would like to also say that this pursuit of knowledge, including systematization in terms of knowledge production, knowledge sharing, and also knowledge protection, is culturally and ecologically specific. And this has a number of implications. One is the fact that as long as there is diversity of cultures globally, there is no one science. It's not only that history has gone in such a way that colonialism tended to make universalize one knowledge system and also one knowledge, one science. And as long as there is diversity of cultures across the world, which are supposed to be complementary, colonialism made one knowledge system dominant and marginalizes all the other knowledge systems. I try to share my screen here. I hope everybody can see the screen. What I'm trying to say here is the fact that we don't have, from the IKS conceptualization, we don't have one science, because we have a diversity of cultures and each culture has its own knowledge system or its own knowledge, science. So the pursuit of knowledge in terms of methodology, in terms of systematization, is culturally and place-based. That's why the issue of history, the issue of language, the issue of ecosystems is very important. I think Professor Nkondo will allude to that one, the role of language in science, in terms of production, in terms of sharing, and in terms of protection. I think Shabalala will also talk of the importance of history, how the history, the systematization of knowledge has also historical context. So we don't have one science. We have different sciences which are culturally and ecologically specific. So it is on that context that the center is advancing a paradigm shift, in the sense that there is no universal reality. So as long as there are different cultures, different languages, diverse, the histories are also different, we can't have one science. Another important aspect is the fact that in the paradigm shift we are trying to advance is the fact that the importance that IKS looks at science as holistic, culturally, multi-transdisciplinary, community-based, and this helps to implement knowledge system and promote the democracy of knowledge systems in the global pool of knowledge. And also another important part, as part of our mandate and as part of our paradigm shift, is that the CIKS, or the Center in Indigenous Knowledge Systems, as part of our mandate, as one of the instruments of the national IKS policy, is to build an active citizenry, mobilizing community knowledge systems to contribute to the global pool of knowledge. And that's why one also of our mandate from the national IKS policy, South Africa is one of the, or in fact, will be the only country in the world, in the continent, with an IKS policy, is to ensure that we use the diversity of our knowledge systems, which are culturally, linguistically, and historically place-based, to enter the global knowledge in our own terms rather than those dictated by others. And also another important aspect in the context of creating that active citizenry through their own knowledge systems is to work together with indigenous knowledge holders, because we believe that knowledge is outside there. Because in the process, as I go to my slide, in the fact that African indigenous communities, in their specific ecological system, through observation, interaction with the natural environment, perhaps with also the spiritual environment over centuries, they developed different bodies of knowledge, which are culturally and ecologically specific. In fact, when the first Europeans came to Africa, even to other parts of the world, among the Native Americans, they depended very much on the indigenous communities in terms of different aspects of their basic needs alive. It's not that when they became customized to the areas, they started enslaving the indigenous people and marginalizing their own knowledge systems. And even as the chairperson was saying, Africa is not only rich in terms of mineral resources, but because of the cultural diversity of the continent, because of the rich knowledge systems, Africa has also contributed greatly to the development of modern science. I think Dr. Shabalala will show us the historical context of knowledge production in Africa, the historical context of knowledge sharing and protection in Africa, which were totally marginalized, and which is our responsibility to rewrite our own history, as Professor Nkonde has always worked with us to ensure that we must develop our own history of ideas. I remember the time
Thank you, Professor Kaya, for these remarks. We're going to move to the next speaker, but I think this is actually a very good point to stop on. And I now ask Mr. Adum to speak with our audience and share your message as well.
Thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amin Idris, and I work for the African Union Development Agency. So, science and African Renaissance is quite a big subject. But let me start my remark with the 2018 WIPO statistics. So, in 2018, the world have recorded about 3.17 million patents. And if you look at the numbers, China alone registered 1.3 million, while the United States have recorded about 600,000 patents. So about half of the Chinese patents. Africa overall recorded only 12,500 patents, out of which South Africa actually accounted for more than the half, 7,000, followed by Morocco, 2,200. And now, if you look at this is about the patents. If you go in terms of trademarks, WIPO recorded in 2018 about 12 million filing activities. And China, again, accounted for about 46% of all filing activities for trademarks. But here, there is an interesting indicator to watch out. South Africa has increased, actually, its filing activities for trademark in 2018 by 36% year on year. And it has performed as part of the top 10 worldwide for application plus count by unit of GDP. So it is also worth to note that trademarks filing activities by sector is dominated mostly by agriculture and clothing from China, health from the US, and research and technology for European countries. Now, as for the industrial design, in 2018, WIPO recorded about 1.2 million filing activities. So 50% of all industrial design filing activities were again from China, and the rest is distributed between the United States, South Korea, Japan, European countries. In Africa, and from Africa, actually, we have Morocco, South Africa, and Egypt. Those are the only 3 countries in Africa that have submitted filing requests for industrial design. In fact, South Africa, Morocco, and Egypt, and this is very good news, they are even ranked among the top 10 countries for industrial design filing activities, according to the WIPO report for 2018. So the WIPO report actually is very interesting in many points, and I would like to share with you a few observations. So number one, the statistics actually give the impression that there is a strong causality between the number of patents in a specific country and its political system. Many social scientists already demonstrated the fact that a political system characterized by freedom of thought and freedom of speech is good for science. But if you look at the number again very carefully and you go into some details by country, you see that the number of patents does not necessarily correlate with the freedom of speech. In fact, there are countries that have a very high number of patents recorded, but a very tight and very closed political system. And I will come back to that later. The second observation is that it seems there is a strong correlation as well between number of patents and the GDP. In fact, the two biggest players here in that report are China and the US. And they are two biggest actually world economy, probably the most wealthiest economies in the world. But here again, if you look at carefully the data, you will notice that there are countries with quite modest GDP that have produced an incredible number of patents. That clearly tells that GDP is not all, it's not the only driver. There might be some other factor, which of course have something to do with money, obviously, but it is probably more than money only. And the third observation is that in most of the countries, being the US or China or even South Africa, private sector is the biggest sponsor for patent actually production. And if you look at again carefully the report, you will see that the only African countries that exceeded 1,000 patents are the ones that have a very strong private sector. But not only this, private sector in those countries, especially in Africa, is much better organized, formalized, and structured than in any other African country. So the lesson here is that private sector, especially the informal private sector, is not going to help producing science, technology, and innovation. Probably, if we keep them in the form that they are today. Now, when looking into the history of the developing countries that are currently trending in science and technology and innovation with regard to patent production, there are 5 factors that play a very important role. Number 1, strong public sector with transparent and solid governance. Number 2, huge public investment to create the necessary conditions to emulate research. Number 3, extremely competent private sector, including dynamic banking sector. And number 4, a top-notch education system. And finally, probably the most important factor, a very strong cultural identity. Now, you will see that the above factors are not rocket science. And any African country actually can really put them in place to create the conditions that are needed to drive research, science, and technology. But it seems that we are not, or we are having difficulties. So the question is, why? My response would be, actually, we need to go back to the challenge of governance. Governance looks very easy. It might be probably also the most difficult thing to implement, given the historical background of our countries and all the disturbances that come from the illegal European occupations of our territories. So good governance may mean many things, but I would like to keep the most significant. It means balanced, transparent, and rigorous way of getting public sector to work. But this is not the case today here. We have really difficulties. So, and to bring my second point here, because our governance system is quite actually weak, our public sector in most of our countries is dysfunctional. And without a functional public sector, sorry, you cannot actually really run science. It's very difficult. Now, unless we change the public sector, I think that we will still be facing problems. My third point is that because of our governance challenge, which actually lead us to have quite weak public sector, we ended up having as well a dysfunctional private sector. Our private sector is not working. It's working. People, in fact, are surviving. Out of the 95 million micro, small, and medium enterprises in Africa, less than 8% are registered and work in a modern and functioning way. So, of course, it's not their fault. It just means that public sector must step up actually its work. That's actually extremely important. So, because of those challenges, I would say challenging governance, weak public sector, informal private sector, with a very weak actually banking sector. I think we are facing difficulties. Now, with all those bad things that I have just said, does it mean that we cannot conduct research? Of course we can. And Africa have done great in the past. And our history is full of examples of great African scientists and contributors to the global science. But with today's challenge, the global crisis, can we really bring back our science and start telling our own narratives? I would say we should, actually. And why we should recognize that the world is changing. We have also scientists who are really doing their best. We should actually step up our game. We should create the conditions, and those conditions start with a solid governance, well-organized public sector, well-organized private sector. Those are the very key and minimum conditions that we need to put in place. Then from that, I think we need as well really to push to have a solid education system. And as the professor have said, we need as well to step up the history, the story, start telling our own narrative, our history, and finally telling the world, what Africa is and how Africa can contribute this to the science, using our own words, our own languages. So the Renaissance actually is there. But again, I do believe that we still have some steps. The steps of governance, the step of strong public sector, the step of strong private sector, the step actually of strong education system, and really the most important step, developing and owning our own cultural identity. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Adum. Those were wonderful remarks. Just quick reminders before I call on our next speaker. Please send your questions over through the Q&A. We are collecting all the questions and then we'll pose them to the speakers during the Q&A session. For those of you that are listening on YouTube Live, there's also a mechanism there for you to be able to submit your questions there. We're also monitoring that channel. So please feel free to send your questions to our speakers and we'll address them during Q&A. Next, I call on Professor Kondo. Please unmute yourself. So maybe while he's resolving that, I think so that we're not losing time, Dr. Chabalala, maybe you can you can kick us off, and then Dr. Kondo can Professor Kondo can give his remarks after you.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah, and greetings to my dear colleagues. And I'd also like to recognize Mema Shell and also whoever is listening throughout the African continent. I'd like to in the diaspora. I don't know if I should continue or would you like Prof to go on?
Please, Dr. Chabalala, if let's have Professor go on, and then you can step back in.
Okay.
I'm very sorry.
Sorry.
I want to apologize. I was born far before technology. Just firstly, thanks very much, and I want also to acknowledge, a presence of our chairperson here, Honorable Tamasha. I just have 3-4 questions to ask, and then I'll make a general statement. Last year, we had a similar workshop, slightly different context. But now we are having almost the same workshop, but this time it's in the shadow of COVID-19. That changes the parameters and changes the dynamic, the sense of agency involved here. What in this context is the value of African languages? How can we use African languages, African knowledge systems, and African culture as a force for global solidarity? I think that, to me, given the history of repression, the history of marginalization, how strategic are African languages and their systems as a force for global solidarity? That, to me, is the key question. Particularly when you remember that global solidarity, by the way, is not just an idea. It is not just a thought, but it's at the same time a feeling. It is an attitude, and also a form of ethical action. Those are the three imperatives: the thought, a feeling, an attitude, but also a form of ethical action. Given the complexity of the world and given the history of antagonism, what will be the strategic function of African languages in COVID-19? I think that's an important question. I want to suggest that we develop a strategy where we suggest to the international state system that the language policies of the world in which African languages, were marginalized, should be reviewed radically. Because if the language policies continue the way they are, where our languages are suppressed, are minoritized, we won't have a place in COVID-19. So I'm suggesting that we work out a policy, influence AU, influence the UN to change the language policies of the world. That's important. That, to me, is very, very important. We already have a lot of experience in this whole, policy around bilingualism, multilingualism, languaging. We have in Africa experience on how to use language, African languages, in cosmopolitan environment. So we have that experience, and let's use it to say it's not enough for us to talk about COVID-19 and everything else only in terms of English and French. Our languages have the capacity to contribute to global knowledge. A third point I want to suggest is that IKS has never been taken seriously as science. Even now, when you listen to the WHO, there is no respectable reference to the contribution of IKS to the problems that we're facing, which says to us, we've got to demonstrate to the Solidarity Fund, we've got to demonstrate to the WHO that there is in African science capabilities to solve some of the problems that we are facing. That needs an inter-science. We need to bring together our mathematicians, our engineers to say, here are the capabilities that we have, and this is how we can intervene in the global solidarity movement. Closely linked to that, it is very easy to link to LDO, to physics, to experts. Only about 10% of us in Africa can comprehend the language of COVID-19. Very, very few of us can. So we need to find out a way in which these complicated technical terms can be translated into African languages. So that they are articulated within the context of our idioms. That's a challenge. I suggest, therefore, that we think of compiling an African COVID ID dictionary, a dictionary that will identify the key terms that are frequently used in any discourse on COVID. We translate all these terms to all the major African languages. If we don't do that, COVID ID discourse will remain the preoccupation of the elite. So let us think carefully how to mobilize resources that we communicate the major messages about COVID ID to our people. And that needs a comprehensive dictionary identifying all the key terms that are frequently used in any discourse on IKS. That's important. Finally, if you want to mobilize Africans, if you want them to be part of a global community, you can only do that through their languages, not through science, not through English or French. So let's find a way in which, if we want to mobilize feeling and attitude and forms of action, African languages are very, very critical. It's extremely important that we do that. That means that we must look for an institution in Africa where feelings and attitudes are inaugurated. And that institution is the family. It's on the father's lap or the mother's lap where attitudes and feelings and forms of action are inaugurated. If the international state system wants to mobilize feeling around the world, it must take the family seriously as part of a policy subsystem. The family, you cannot just use the state or experts. The family must be actively involved in mobilizing the new consciousness, the new sensibility, and the new imagination. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nkondo. And now, Dr. Chavala, back to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And as I was saying, that I would also like to recognize my dear colleagues, but also the two elder scholars. Professor Kaya has sharpened me in terms of the little that I know in terms of indigenous knowledge systems. We journeyed together for years as we're creating the Center of Excellence, but also the now degree in indigenous knowledge systems, which we hope will actually do some of the things that Professor Nkondo is saying. At the same time, Baba Nkondo, I have listened to him so many times, and every time that I listen to him, I get more inspired because he brings it home. I would also like to acknowledge Mama Michelle for your leadership. When I was talking to Kiratilwe, one of the things that I said I would like to talk about is what you said, Mama, in the link that they sent me, that these knowledges that we have in Africa must be systematized, because if we don't systematize them, they will still be considered as mambo jumbo, so to say. So my work at the Department of Science and Innovation is really around, it looks around how can we systematize this knowledge and bring in a face to the knowledge, but at the same time, make it as pragmatic and as practical as possible. But also, I like to believe that the reason why you hunted me down is because of some of the things that you have seen me talking about, and this is around the science of African medicines or the healing arts of Africa. And I was requested to then package this in a few pockets, and I would like to share my screen. Then I will take you through. Just to check, is my screen visible? Is the screen visible, Sarah? Okay, wonderful.
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you so much. So the context of my talk today is within what Professor Kaya said, that we don't have one knowledge and we don't have one science. So I'd like to demonstrate by way of invoking those that gave birth to us, our ancestors, because they are the ones that are the custodians of these indigenous knowledge systems, or IKS. Then move on to then share a little bit about how can we systematize, and I'll use some of the examples of the work that I've been working on. And finally, just give you examples of the actual work on the ground in terms of how we're developing African medicines and healing arts. Now, from the onset, I'd like to acknowledge that this work, that these things that I'm going to talk about is not really my work alone. It is the work that rests on the shoulders of the wisdom keepers, mainly the traditional health practitioners that we work with at the Department of Science and Innovation. I would also like to just say there are certain things that are not part of my work at the Department of Science and Innovation, but this is the work that I do in my institute, the Amenra Institute, which is actually created to again source these stories, source this knowledge, which is not really in the mainstream, but also cannot find space as yet within the academia or within the government system. Now, the context and the content of my work, as I said, I will take you a little bit back, whereby we'll look into African origins of medical science, just to demonstrate that science is not a unique thing. Our ancestors were systematic and scientific. And as I said, then I will propose some of the systems development models or protocols, and then end up with our work at Science and Innovation, but also with a brave call, not only for us who are here, the converted, but mainly a brave call to our leaders that we need to start looking into manufacturing. Brother Idris indicated that countries that are successful are countries that have a strong private sector, and you can't have a strong private sector if you're not manufacturing. However, we need to take these things into curriculum. We need to develop curriculum. We need to build universities and colleges around things that I'll be talking about. And then finally, we need to build an alternative health system. We can't afford a colonial health system, and I'm not kicking it in the throat. I'm simply saying that countries in the Oriental, you look into Korea, China, India, Singapore, these countries have traditional health systems. As I say, you choose whether you want to go to a traditional hospital or use traditional medicines or allopathic medicine. Now let's start here. In Africa, we use totems. Now the picture that you're seeing, the bed man that you're seeing on the picture, his name is Teuti, simply a principle. It's a principle like if you say a molecule, a biochemical molecule. Our ancestors presented knowledge in the form of whatever they saw in nature. So this totem, which was called Teuti, it is the principle of science, it is the principle of medicine, it was also the principle of so many scientific or knowledge systems in ancient Africa. The Africa that today we will call ancient Egypt, not the current Egypt, but really the ancient Egypt. Now this picture is from one of the university complex then, or temple if you like, built by one Emperor Menmaat Ra. Some of you will know him as Seti I. He has all these principles throughout the temple, whereby you see how sciences and knowledges were cultivated by those who were going through that system. It is this principle of Teuti that inspired some of the ancient medical scientists, African medical scientists. The most popular one is the one known as Imhotep or Imhotep, who lived just over 4,000 500 years ago, almost 5,000 years ago, Imhotep was a prime minister, one, but also he was a multi-genius. He's the one that built the step pyramid of Egypt. However, he had vast knowledge of various types of diseases, whether it was internal medicine, whether it was ops and gyn. Around his time, he had his contemporary. His name was Hesi Ra, and you can see he's got a beautiful afro. Hesi Ra was a surgeon. He was a dentist. He understood the physiology of the body that had to do with anything bone-like. But we didn't only have men, we also had women. Peseshet, she lived around the very same time as Imhotep, and so was Merit Ptah. These ladies were chief physicians. They were the head of the medical doctors, especially in hospitals that had to do with women's health. And 1,000 years later, we had a lady, a queen called Queen Tiye. Queen Tiye actually built hospitals, especially child health, women's health related hospitals. All that I'm saying is that we have precedent. Our children and grandchildren can go back in antiquity and really see and find people like themselves who were actually physicians and scientists, in this case in medical science, but also other sciences. Now, when we're talking about science, often in the indigenous knowledge system space, as Professor Kaya said, we often fight because we feel that the way we're doing science within the indigenous knowledge systems context is not appreciated. Whereas what people don't know is that we have been scientific, as I said, and we called scientific methods in the language called Medunate. It's almost like a dead language. However, if you speak Bantu languages and some of the West African and East African languages, which are not necessarily Bantu languages, you can easily understand this ancient language. We called scientific methods Tep Cheseb, or the correct methods. There was, just after Imhotep time, around 5th, 4th dynasty, there was a prime minister. His name was Ptah-Hetep. And actually, Ptah-Hetep's document is the oldest written document found in existence today. There is no written papyrus or paper older than the writings of Ptah-Hotep, that which was discovered on earth today, besides things that were written in some of the tombs in ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt. He said that we need to contemplate the correct methods of coming into higher forms of reasoning, which was called Medut Nefert. Nefert means beautiful or excellent. And Medut is really imagination. And through imagination, we then come up with various ways of doing what we may call science. Then 1,000 years later, 800 to 1,000 years later, we had a mathematician. His name was Meshu or Mose. The papyrus that you're seeing at the bottom right corner actually is the living papyrus, the living document, which was translated or transcribed by this gentleman called Meshu 1,000 years later after Ptah-Hotep and Imhotep. He lived during the times of a king called User-Ra. And in this papyrus, in the beginning of this papyrus, he actually says that he was just digitizing it, if you like. He was just copying an older papyrus, which was getting old. It was getting destroyed, and he had to then copy that old papyrus, that old book, in a new book. Now, the first lines of this book also talk about this Tep Cheseb. This is the statement that you see on top. And this statement, which is on top, it says that it was an instruction from the professor of that time, from the scribe of that time, to the students, that the students must reckon must reckon the correct methods of investigating nature. Now, when we talk about science, we're talking about especially natural sciences, whether physics, chemistry. We're talking about ways of investigating nature. Professor Hassan, Professor Kaya mentioned that there's no way in which we can do science without nature. So our ancestors said that we need to develop, or we need to reckon or discern the correct methods of investigating nature. Then everything that is hidden in nature will be revealed to us. And in this papyrus, they then state in that ancient African language, which is a dead language now, the process of actually coming into solving the unknown or the mysteries or the hidden. And when you look into all these steps that they actually documented in this papyrus, which was written almost 3,500, 600 years ago, you see that the methods are actually scientific methods, that you are always confronted with a problem in science, then you need to articulate that science, then come up with the scientific methods on how to investigate that problem. Then you examine the evidence. After you do research, you examine the results, and out of the results, you should be able to see what is the transformation, what are the issues that are emerging out of this research. Then you come up with the solution, and it's only after you implement the solution that you live a perfect life. So what I'm saying is that we shouldn't be afraid to declare that whatever we're doing, whether it's in physics, whether it's in chemistry, whether it's biomedical research, it has got nothing to do necessarily to do with Western science. We had this system, and actually they copied these systems from us, because we know that all these papyrus are sitting in their museum in Europe and the Americas. For example, there are a lot of stolen papyrus, medical papyrus. I can't even talk about astronomy, mathematics, and warfare. Whatever knowledge system that you thought of, our ancestors documented these things. So it's not necessarily true that indigenous knowledge systems is actually oral. While that is true, down the Nile Valley, we actually documented. And these scripts here, these writing scripts here, are not the only scripts. We had more than, some say we had more than 50 writing scripts throughout the African continent. However, when it comes to medical science, you can see a list of papyrus which are in the Museum of Europe in various knowledge fields, medical knowledge fields. This is just a sneak preview. I can talk on each one of them. Some people, even Professor Kaya, used to challenge me. Why do you keep on referring on ancient Egypt? I said, because we are the ancient Egyptians. If you are Bantu, you are an ancient Egyptian. There are various ways in which we could confirm that. One, the language, two, the culture. But how do you know that someone is your parent or your child today? We do blood tests, right? We use the so-called DNA. Now, there is a marker in our blood. There is a marker which is called E1B1A or EM2. It's a haplogroup. It's a marker which tells you who your parents are or who your descendants are. Now, when some scientists got together, they looked into the mummies from the 17 to 18 dynasty all the way to the 20th dynasty. And what they determined, what they found out from these mummies, they found that these mummies, the descendants of these mummies, but also the parents of these mummies actually came mainly from Southern Africa, also from the Great Lakes and West Africa. And even today, the descendants of these people that lived around 3,000 years ago, you find them in these regions in Africa. A good example is this one. Most of you know of Tutankhamen. These two mummies are actually his paternal grandparents, and these two mummies on the far left are his maternal grandparents. What they did with these mummies, including Tutankhamen, they determined what is called the ethnic group affiliator or predictor. And what they found out is that these mummies were over 90% sub-Saharan African. The Euro-Asian genes, like from the Levant, like Saudi Arabia or the then ancient Canaan, was less than 6%, 5%, because they were admixtures, because we interacted with people from those regions. However, over 90% of their genes were sub-Saharan Africa, which then demonstrated that these people indeed were Africans. And the latest studies even demonstrate that they were of Bantu origin, including their language. Now, when it comes to systematization, how do we systematize? It is said that nations that have what we call cosmograms. Cosmograms is things that you see in our clothes, all these kind of drawings that you see in our houses, because they frame a way of thinking. Now, in my PhD, what I tried to investigate was how did our ancestors frame, how did they think? What was their thinking process? And if you think using that model, it will be easy for you then to actually engage anything. They started with ontology, a way of being, which then informs your cosmology, which is your worldview. Your worldview informs how you do things, axiology. And it is out of your experiences that you then frame your epistemology. I know in academia, we start at epistemology, but traditionally we start with the way of being. And it is out of this process that we can then come up with theories. Theory meaning that is the confirmation of what is true. Then the cosmogonies, all those designs, African designs that are in our clothes, that are in our, whatever you see that is African, all those things are very, very important because then they frame how we think. When it comes to medicines, as part of my master's in public health and my interaction with my teachers, and also me as a African medicines practitioner or Sangoma, I stayed with my teachers and we started to then interrogate these issues. But I also studied in China and in Japan and a little bit in India. And what I recognize is that the reason why the Indians and the Chinese or the Oriental countries are so successful in terms of their medical systems, they started with medical cosmologies. They investigated their medical cosmologies, which then helped them classify diseases, what is called disease theory, but also they managed to classify their medicines. Hence, they understand what causes disease and disease progression. They understand how to diagnose, how to come up with prognosis, and of course, treatment. This is very essential. We don't have these systems in Africa, or they are there, but we haven't systematized them as yet. This is what we call then the heart of the disease theory. I won't talk on this because it's part of the book chapter that will be published this September. However, this model says that in terms of disease classification or medicines classification, what it is saying is that, for example, COVID, it's a respiratory disease. It's a cold disease. That's why you feel cold, your lungs get clogged up. So it's a cold disease, it's a water disease. To heal it, you need fire medicines, for example, to counter it. So this is the central model which I sourced out from those elders, these people, from these people. I went and fetched this model from the archives, and it's time for us to bring it back. And Professor Kaya, I'm saying those students that are doing the health aspect of the stream, let's let's develop curriculum on this. This will grow into a medical degree curriculum, because we need to have traditional medicines degrees, not just one stream within BIKS. Now, as I conclude, I wanted to just share with you what is it that we're doing at the Department of Science and Innovation. One is that it is said that South Africa alone is the third most biodiverse country in the world, following Brazil and Indonesia. But imagine if we were to combine all the medicines in Africa, Brazil will come number 27, because Africa is huge, it's a huge continent. In South Africa alone, we've got 300 traditional health practitioners. What if we include all those are in the African continent? It's a whole system. It's a whole health system that we're not tapping into. And more than 70% of our people use traditional medicines. And this is, in terms of commercialization alone, this is a almost 2 trillion market. So what is it that I'm saying? At the Department of Science and Innovation, we have a model which we call Ubuntu-based bioinnovation model, which uses indigenous knowledge. We use a multiplicity of knowledge systems to do research, not one science. All science systems which are multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary. We are inclusive in the work that we do, meaning that we work hand in hand with the wisdom keepers. When we find technologies, we localize them back where the knowledge comes from, and then we build enterprises and we come up with what we call conscious commerce, meaning that we propagate the medicines, for example, of food, so that we don't render some of our biodiversity extinct. This is just a linear model of what we do, that we work with the wisdom keepers. We sign agreements from the get-go, especially on access and benefit sharing. This is the main work at the Department of Science and Innovation. We plant these things out there in the villages. We come up with product. We set up small, medium enterprises, and they commercialize. We have 6 platforms, one on medicines, one on cosmetics, food, health, beverages, just like that. So we've divided our work into these 6 platforms. And this is the impact. For example, out of 52 projects, we've got over 100 commercial products. We have over 50, almost 55 small, medium enterprises in the form of SMMEs and cooperatives. We have not 112, we have 12 patents, we have 29 brands, we have 30 pieces of land where we actually propagating and manufacturing. We have 50 licenses all around the world. And the call to the leaders is that let's work towards developing medical cosmologies. Various, whether it's East African, West African, Central African, various cosmologies, medical cosmologies, let's develop them. Let's strengthen our innovation systems. Let's come up with regulations for these medicines. Let's produce these medicines. Let's manufacture here at home. Let's not buy medicines from out there. Let's strengthen the educational system. As I said, let's have universities like China and India has. Like this, then we can then have health systems where our people can choose whether they use allopathic medicines or African medicines. And finally, we can actually then commercialize these medicines, whether it's in our hospitals and clinics in terms of clinical use, but also in terms of commerce. Then we can trade with these things. And whatever we're manufacturing, our people, our wisdom keepers must be co-owners of these manufacturing companies. And the
Thank you, Dr. Chabalala.
Thank you so much.
We're a little bit over time, so I want
fine.
to try and keep us on time.
Yeah, that's it. That's what I wanted to share. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much. And that was really educational. So next, what we'll be doing is going into Q&A. So what I will do is I will actually read out all of the various questions, and then I will call on our different speakers to give us some responses to them. And instead of everybody answering, the question, I'll call on one or two of you to tackle so that we keep time. So the first question, and some of these I'm going to summarize as they've been written they're a little longer. Why is it that despite knowing our glamorous past years before colonialism, the reason why our forefathers and mothers fought for independence, why do our leaders continue to foster policies that entrench division rather than unity for Africa? How can we use indigenous knowledge to develop the continent? And this question is from Maurice, who's a PhD student in Tangaza University in Kenya. So that's the first question. The second one is shorter, and is what are typical African cultural identities? So that one's clearly kind of written. And then another question is, my question relates to Sankofa. How far back should we claim our historical contribution to science as people who have given birth to civilization? Kemetic Egypt is Black African civilization. So this relates directly back to some of what Dr. Chabalala was also sharing. In my arguments, I have always argued that as Africans, we are letting go of our indigenous knowledge and focusing more on what is Western. I believe that if we really do some introspection in our indigenous knowledge, we can overcome the majority. Okay, so as I'm reading this, I'm realizing this is an opinion, so we can move on to that, and we can kind of bring up opinions later. Hi there. IKS is a model that is limited to specific majors. In what pedagogical ways can it be included as a pragmatic orientation and program that involves the classroom and the real world reality, as well as the knowing and learning of self? Oh, there's lots of questions coming in. So I might actually just do one more question to start, and then call on everybody. As you've heard all the questions, feel free to tap into the ones that you feel that you can respond to. Is it clear that Blackness and its history is undervalued amongst people of color and undertaught in academia, socially, or publicly? How do we prevent the watered down understanding of IKS, Blackness, Africa to Africans in light of globalization and modernity? So let me stop with the questions there for now, and then if we have time, I can bring in a second wave of questions as well. So I think given the kind of the diversity of the questions that are being asked, what I'll do is I'll actually go in the same order of how we heard the presentations, and just ask on our speakers to speak to some of these questions, and obviously they're all connected in some way as well, so we can tackle a few at the same time. So Professor Kaya, we can start with you and hear your thoughts on some of these questions that have been asked. If you can unmute, yes.
Okay. I mean, as I said during my short presentation, there is no one science. As long as we live in different cultural and ecosystems, there is no one science. And what did colonialism was to marginalize the other sciences and make only one science predominant. So what indigenous knowledge is one of the questions was saying, can contribute to the renaissance of the continent, is mobilizing these grassroots knowledge systems. And that's in fact what the National Development Plan in South Africa is trying to do in the sense, in order to create an active citizenry, we need to base that active citizenry to their community-based knowledge systems. because IKS brings a new paradigm shift, whereby these indigenous, as Shabalala was calling them, wisdom keepers, whatever, yeah, those are the ones who are the custodians, especially women. They're the custodians of indigenous knowledge. And these people have been marginalized. Even now in the COVID-19, there have been a number of discussions on why indigenous knowledge holders, traditional healers, even if those who are involved in agriculture, even our own agriculture systems have been marginalized. So indigenous knowledge, our center of excellence, is part of that mandate to mobilize these knowledge systems so that they can become active in meeting the challenges of the 21st century and also contribute to the global pool of knowledge. So IKS is a new, our effort to mobilize IKS, our effort to bring IKS not only in the issues of science and technology, but also in issues of governance, democracy, and other aspects, so that to create an active scenario. As long as our people are marginalized, Africa cannot move forward. As long as we have everything only from the West, our knowledge system don't matter. Our languages don't. That's why I agree with the Professor Nkondo that the issue of language is very central. Our children are educated in Western ways of knowing, in Western languages. So indigenous knowledge contributes to that active citizenry, whereby people, especially women, girls and women, become active in the knowledge domain, also in the systematization of our indigenous knowledge systems. I remember I give one example. One time when I was a student in Germany, there was a Korean neighbor of mine. He said to me, his professor taught him that before Europeans came to Africa, Africans had no history. And what we are feeding our children now in Africa is the history of Europeans in Africa. That is what I believe in, that we have no history.
Thank you very much, Professor. Next, I will call on Mr. Adum. Maybe you can give us some remarks and some responses to some of those questions.
Sarah, and thank you as well for. I would say that there is a strong link between development of science and cultural identity, in fact. And if you look at actually the way Europe have made progress, the Western world have made progress in science, it started like 200 years ago, where they started actually stepping up the game and accelerating. And that coincides precisely with the time where they have shifted, in the way they look at the world. 200 or 300 years ago, European culture started, I would say, loving far in the past, like 1,700 years, total since the beginning of the Christianity, money was not something that was praised, was appreciated. And then about something acceptable, and it started to become as well a kind of driver for change. At that time, with the starting of capitalism, we have started to see as well
I think we have.
So, coming back to Africa, I would say you have left the continent. Occupation, illegal occupation, I am always hesitant to call it really colonization. Let's say it is illegal occupation that was used to exploit actually the continent with a lot of damages, And this occupation, the length of the occupation was, hello?
Mr. Adum, I think your connection has kind of started to cut up.
I think I was blocked.
Yeah, it was. We were not hearing you so clearly. So I think what we can do is let me go to the
now
next.
It's okay. Is it better?
it's still quite crackly, so it's really
Okay.
difficult to
I'll come back.
yeah,
You bring me back.
come back, yeah. Next, Professor Nkondo, maybe you can give us some of your responses and thoughts. You're still muted, so you'll have to unmute. You are still muted. Professor Nkondo, I don't know if you can hear me, but you're still muted. Dr. Chabalala, can you maybe intervene now and give us some responses, and then we can get Professor Nkondo set up.
Yeah, well, the questions are very diverse. So if I had to sum up everything, one is I would ask our audience, to go and find out of
Hello?
the.
Okay.
Should Elder continue?
Yes, please.
What was that?
Okay, yes, please continue and give us some of your responses, please.
Who, me?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm very sorry the second time. Sorry for this. I just, firstly, I should just indicate that I submitted to the organizers of this webinar a very comprehensive paper on this issue. And I hope you are going to circulate the paper too. And it's going to get published soon. There are two things that I thought I should emphasize, and I've done that before. The problem we have in Africa is that we have very profound moral wisdoms. We have Ubuntu, we have Pan-Africanism, we have negritude, we have very profound moral wisdom. But we don't have the scientific power to back it up. Why Europe continues to govern us? Because in the Enlightenment, science and their kind of values merged. So when they want to push a certain system of values, they use science and technology. They build roads, they have bombs, they have ammunition. So the power of the West is that very powerful blending of science and values. And they continue to use that combination. They are able to invade us, we can't even defend ourselves. In spite of the superior moral wisdoms that we have, the challenge going forward is to make sure that we advance our scientific capabilities. Just now, all the major cities in Africa were built on Western technology, all of them. All the major roads, all the major bridges, we have not been able to assemble scientific knowledge to control the material forces in this world. That is the problem. Ubuntu without bridges takes us nowhere. Ubuntu without roads, Ubuntu without ammunition. So there is a disjuncture in Africa between profound moral wisdom, but very weak scientific capability. And that's the problem, which leads me to the second one. In the fourth industrial revolution, particularly in the age of COVID, 19, it's very important that as we talk about solidarity and social cohesion and Ubuntu, let's make sure that we enhance our scientific capabilities so that we can make things happen in the world. Now, with all our profundities, Africa cannot make things happen in the world. And before we can build our own roads, use our own trucks, build our own bridges, fight our own wars using our own weapons. The world will never respect us. That's why I was saying earlier that we must find a way in which we educate for ideas, we educate for science, we educate for technology. But this time, unlike Europe, as we educate for ideas, let's combine that with educating for values. It is that new epistemology I've been talking about for years now. That integration of science, skills, knowledge, and scientific power. And it's important that I said earlier on, it's very important that we can talk about science. But science has been used so far against Africa. Science has been used to push European desires. Okay? So science itself is a very, very dangerous instrument nowadays. But how can we intervene? We intervene by saying, if you want to farm in Africa, if you want to build a bridge in Africa, make sure that your engineering and your public ethics are interviewed. It is educating not just for thought, but educating for feeling and attitude. That's why I said that global solidarity is an idea, but at the same time, a feeling is an attitude and a form of action. And those imperatives got to be integrated into our curriculum. Those dynamics got to be integrated in our epistemology. That's how we can begin to make it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Dr. Chabalala?
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think I was starting here that someone said that whoever controls the narrative when it comes to your heritage controls your present moment. And whoever controls science and technology controls the future. And this is very clear when it comes to Africa, that our historical and heritage narrative was told by someone else. And we never really told our own story. So in terms of how far back should we go, we must reclaim everything which is ours, without exception, whether it's us in the African continent or Africans that found themselves in other parts of the world, because we contributed knowledge in those parts of the world. I mentioned that I studied in China and in Japan, and I learned that there were Africans who went to those parts of the world and they developed systems. And we have a genuine claim to those systems that they developed wherever they went. So that's one. Secondly, I think in line with what my elder scholars have said, I was asking the question which I have asked before. If you were to look into Germany, UK, France, Japan, Singapore, China, what language do they use to teach their children? These countries. None of them use foreign languages. They use their own languages to teach everything. So yes, I guess part of the work that needs to go into academia is that we need to start distilling all these scientific jargons in our own languages so that we teach our children in our own languages. I spent some time in Mozambique in December, and with one of the bishop of the Anglican Church in Mozambique. And they said that they asked that a few schools in Gaza be taught in local languages like Shichopi, Shangan-related languages. And what they discovered is that those children who were taught mathematics, just mathematics in their local language, they excelled in other subjects. So it's a good example that this can be done as it has been done in other countries. And then finally, in our department, in our work as Indigenous Knowledge System Technology Innovation, we often say that we don't wanna have a conversation because demonstration beats any form of conversation anywhere in the world at all times. Hence, we have these models which we have piloted, which we have demonstrated that actually these things can be done. Hence, for example, now we have a center of excellence across the 5 universities. And this center of excellence is the one that is then supposed to create all these various knowledge fields, whether it's science or whatever else, that's one. We have demonstrated with this Ubuntu-based bioinnovation model that we've come up with a platform for African traditional medicines where we can do research from the beginning of basic research as we work with the wisdom keepers or knowledge holders to a product. And as I demonstrated, now we have land where we're growing medicines. We have over 50 manufacturing or small medium enterprises who are doing agro-processing, manufacturing medicines and indigenous foods. And these things are owned by the wisdom keepers. All I'm saying is that indeed the time for having a conversation is done. Now we have examples that we can use, whether it's in this country or elsewhere in the African continent, as a unifying force. A good example with regard to COVID. We're working with the World. Yes. Okay.
I'm so sorry. We're going to run out of time, and there's many questions that we were unfortunately not going to be able to address, but we've written them all down, and we'll be following up with all of the questions that have people who have asked questions. So we'll be following up with you from Minds with responses, and reach out to the respective speakers and get some responses for you. But I know we're going to run a little bit over time, but I would like to now call on Mrs. Michelle to give us some closing remarks after an invigorating discussion such as this.
Oh, I won't say anything.
Okay. Thank you so much indeed to all the speakers first, but also thanks to all those who joined the discussions from different parts of our continent. I think this was really an extraordinary afternoon. And I hope and I can promise as Minds that we definitely have to follow up with this theme again, not as a celebration of the day, but as part of our programming as an institution which aims to promote African heritage in order to shape policy and practice on critical issues of governance, integrated economic development, and evolution of African institutions. So on that base, I promise that we'll follow up with this theme very, very consistently. I think we had very good, extraordinary presentations, but I wanted just to mention 3 or 4 things. One is we had a very good example of cooperation. These universities which are around the Institute of Indigenous Knowledge are a good example of cooperation amongst institutions which are doing research on one specific theme. Perhaps what I would say is that we need to disseminate this much more. I'm not so sure whether they are many people, not only to know that there are these universities working together, but more importantly is the products which are coming out of the collective effort of these minds who are producing year after year a lot of information which should be informing many of our institutions, one, and should be also be part of what is teaching in our schools. This is one. We had also a very good example of how Africa has been, in fact, has been at the origin of sciences which today are considered to be modern science, but which are not linked to indigenous knowledge, not linked to what Africa has offered ever since, and it evolved to be today global ownership of science, but it's not connected to Africa. I think Sarah was doing this, they mentioned this at the beginning to say, we do not have the link between the African heritage and what is the innovation which is happening today. And the presentation by Dr. Shabalala was a very, very pertinent example of how it is happening. I wish we would be able to bring many other examples. And Dr. Moyo was saying something which is important as well to underline here. If we are able to have, for instance, Dr. Shabalala making a presentation to young African minds, that sense of self-belief to say we as Africans, we are able to produce science, we have influenced science all over, centuries, and we are here and we take ownership of that capability of producing science and to develop. I think it would be a huge contribution for young minds who are questioning, who are we? Where have we been? And why, for instance, the West seems to be the only world where science is producing and we don't have it here. I take note of the ideas, for instance, of taking the examples which Dr. Shabalala was bringing to create even institutions which can be alternative to what we call modern health systems or modern, medicine. It's much exact. Modern medicine to have our own, African type of medicines. China and Japanese and all this, they have the two working side by side. And they don't put aside their own way of healing as a position to only, the modern way of healing. I think we have an obligation to vindicate ourselves, bringing those examples of what has been done and where we are now. I'm taking also note of the importance perhaps of having this, what we called during this conversation, it's not, we said holders, we said science, indigenous science holders. I wish we will be able as minds to bring those indigenous science holders to talk to us, to talk to those who consider themselves as scientists in universities, in different institutions, but in which we would have young people, sitting there, listening, again, as a way of owning what is African ability and capabilities of producing science. So I wouldn't try even to summarize what has been discussed here. What I'm saying is, I'm very happy that we did organize this. And thank you, Kira, for organizing this for all of us. And I'm really enthusiastic about the follow-ups which we can take from these discussions today, and to have within the African Heritage Program of Minds, to have a series of events in which we go deeper and deeper, but also we bring more and more people around. And yes, why not in future, whether it's a virtual, as we are entering into the virtual world, whether it's in in attendance physically, to have conferences which we promote exactly to debate this as a way also of disseminating and publicizing who we are and what we do. So I just wanted really to say thank you very much. We will make sure that we have taken note, one, of the presentations which have been presented, of the questions which were asked, and Sarah was saying quite rightly, we will address them to the speakers, and please make yourself available to respond to the questions so that we can take them back in writing to those who attended, our webinar, but they didn't get the questions answered. We should be able to answer in writing if the speakers would be willing really to continue to work with us. And finally, I wanted to say, we'll come back to you and ask that there is a link between the African heritage of the Minds institution with some of the publications which you are doing, as simply as a link, so that someone who comes to Mind can be informed that please connect to, for instance, to Amen-Ra Institute, and you can learn much more. Please connect to Indigenous Knowledge Institution, so that, because we don't have a place where we can say we connect those who have been researching, who have a wealth of work and knowledge concentrated, so that through Minds, if you don't mind, we can also be a sort of a channel to indicate to people where to go to know about what African scholars, and if you call also the African indigenous holders, have been producing, so that people will know. We will come to you and ask a way of building this kind of relationship through which Minds can link to the work you are doing. In short, I want to say that was a wonderful way of celebration, but more than a celebration, let's make it a consistent program in which really we bring the best of minds on the continent. We disseminate even more what is being investigated and even what kind of publications have been made out there. And we broaden those who can come together and to become a sort of a community of scholars who are going to establish exactly the link between indigenous knowledge and the modern science, which is now being taken around the world, and even to link with the innovation which is coming anew from African minds. So thank you so much. I think this is all, but you will hear from us very, very, very soon. We'll come back to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. As Mrs. Michelle has promised, we will definitely be in touch, and we'll keep this conversation going. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. They